Welcome to MTSS Essential Component Database Individualization for Tier 3, Module 7. Have you downloaded the Module 7 participant workbook? If not, pause the recording and download the workbook. There are some interactive activities that you can complete during this recording. The Wyoming Department of Education, in partnerships with American Institutes for Research, or AIR, have developed this introductory MTSS professional development series to support rollout of MTSS and the use of evidence-based practices. Today's module, MTSS Essential Components, Data-Based Individualization for Tier 3, is the last of 7 modules about MTSS. The previous 6 modules introduced you to the other essential components of MTSS. The content presented today should in no way be viewed as exhaustive or legally binding. You should continue to seek and participate in ongoing professional development related to the topic presented today and in future modules. By the end of this session, participants will be able to explain the critical features of an MTSS Tier 3 system, describe the 5 steps for designing and implementing Tier 3 database interventions, and apply the problem-solving process to individual data decision-making at Tier 3. In previous modules, you learned that Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, or MTSS in Wyoming, is a prevention framework for school improvement made up of 4 essential components. The 4 components are screening, multi-level prevention system, progress monitoring, and database decision-making. MTSS in Wyoming also encompasses features such as culturally responsive instruction, family engagement, and evidence-based instruction. As you'll notice in the graphic, each of the components and features contribute to improved student outcomes. Today, we will focus on Tier 3, which is embedded in the multi-level prevention system and informed by database decision-making to lead to improved outcomes for students with intensive needs. Think of a time when you worked with a child who continued to struggle despite your best efforts. How did you respond? What supports were available to you? In this module, we will be focusing on the most intensive tier of an MTSS model. In other contexts, Tier 3 may be referred to as intensive interventions or tertiary supports. Regardless of the name used, these supports are for those students who have an intensive need. You'll see that those students require individualized instruction based on student data, are served in small groups, are monitored more frequently than previous tiers, and are meant to address students with significant persistent learning needs. In this section, we'll talk about the critical features of an MTSS Tier 3 system. What is an intensive intervention? Intensive interventions are designed to address severe and persistent learning and behavioral difficulties. They should be driven by data and characterized by an increased intensity, which could be a smaller group or expanded time, and individualization of academic instruction or behavioral supports. The decision to move a student directly to intensive intervention should be made on an individual and case-by-case basis. In most cases, data should be collected over time to help demonstrate that a student's low academic or behavioral challenges are both significant and persistent. When we think about who needs intensive intervention or Tier 3, we think of students who are not making adequate progress in their current instructional program. They're students who present with very low academic achievement and or high intensity or high frequency behavior problems. We also think about students in tiered intervention programs who have not yet responded to Tier II interventions that have been delivered with fidelity and have been found effective for most students. The essential criteria include a data-based individualization. When we think about Tier III, we see that it's more intensive than Tier II interventions. It is adapted to address students' needs in a number of ways, which could be quantitative, increasing the duration or frequency, but it could also be qualitative, which means we change the intervention or the nature of instruction. Tier III, or intensive intervention, uses an iterative process based on data. We'll talk about a problem-solving approach to use during this iterative process. The instructional characteristics of a Tier III intervention require that it is individualized. This is not the same as one-on-one, although it is typically delivered in small groups of 1 to 3 students. It is led by well-trained staff who have experience in individualizing instruction based on student data. Tier III interventions use optimal grouping size, which is based on the research and may be different depending on student age or the needs of that student. In relationship to core, we often think about Tier II as being supplemental. However, decisions about Tier III in its relationship to core are based on individual needs and are made on a case-by-case basis. Intensive interventions should still address general curriculum in an appropriate manner for all students. To learn more about what makes up a Tier III system, find handout 7.1 in your participant packet. This is a self-evaluation of your implementation of Tier III. As you learned in Module 1, the Fidelity rubric outlines the essential criteria for each of the components of an MTSS model. If you look at the last column, which says a 5 at the top, these are the clearly defined dimensions of what makes an effective Tier III system. Pause the recording and take time to review the rubric and then come back. So, what is the purpose of a Tier III intervention and who are they for? Data-based individualization, which is often used to implement Tier III systems, is a systematic method for using data to determine when and how we provide more intensive intervention. It is a process, not an intervention, so it can be used with any existing standardized intervention that you're using at Tier II. It's important to remember that DBI is not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process that requires adjustments over time as student needs change. Its origins are based in modification and experimental teaching that was first developed at the University of Minnesota in 1977 and has been expanded upon by others. The following graphic, which was developed by the National Center on Intensive Interventions, often referred to as NCII, illustrates the progression of DBI, data-based individualization. Throughout the DBI process, we use progress monitoring data to evaluate a student's response to an intervention before moving to the next step. It begins with a Tier II intervention program, and it begins by simple adaptations to our validated intervention program. It's followed by progress monitoring data that's used to evaluate the student's response to an intervention. If the student is not showing enough progress, we'll then collect and review additional data to determine skill deficits. We can use informal diagnostic assessments, such as running records, to identify skill deficits and identify how we can change the initial intervention to better meet the student needs. We use the data to make adaptations to the intervention, and then we follow it with continued progress monitoring to assess whether the adaptations were effective. Handout 7.2 in the participant workbook outlines or provides the graphic that you can use as a visual. In most cases, we want to give students the chance to respond to an effective Tier II intervention that's appropriate to their needs before we determine that they need an intensive individualized intervention. After we go through the DBI steps, we'll talk more about what it means to have a Tier II intervention versus a Tier III. When we think about adequate progress, we often look for students who are meeting their predetermined goals, and students who make adequate progress will continue to receive Tier II supports, which may actually then move to less intensive supports. These students do not need DBI. Students who respond poorly or have no response, those are students who may be considered for DBI or intensive intervention. For an in-depth look of essential components of Tier II interventions, check out Module 6, Tier II. Teams should consider starting with a standardized, evidence-based Tier II intervention for several reasons. When properly trained and properly aligned to the student needs, they tend to work. They're more efficient. Teachers can plan instruction for groups rather than individual students, and teachers don't need to reinvent the wheel. Many require only a modest amount of training, and often paraeducators can do this, deliver the interventions, and many are inexpensive. For a list of available resources for how to select Tier II interventions, consider checking out Handout 7.3 in your participant workbook. What happens if you don't have a published standardized program? Well, don't worry, it's not required. You should use it when it's available and consider augmenting current offerings if there are content areas where you have insufficient resources. Think about the resources that you have available. Are they evidence-based? Can they be supplemented with other resources? While the focus of this module is on Tier III interventions, it's important to note the features that distinguish Tier II from intensive interventions. As we discussed, it's important that students who require additional support receive Tier II standardized interventions. If Tier II interventions are insufficient, each feature of the intervention is intensified to provide Tier III or intensive intervention. You'll notice that the main distinction between Tier II is that Tier II interventions are generally standardized, while intensive interventions are more individualized. While the instruction of a Tier II intervention follows a standard evidence-based program as it was designed, instruction at the intensive level involves adapting that standardized program based on an individual student's data. At the intensive level, intervention is typically made more intensive by increasing the frequency or duration of the instruction or decreasing the group size to meet the student needs. While progress monitoring at least once a month is generally sufficient for Tier II, at the intensive level, it's recommended that you collect data weekly. Lastly, you'll note that the population served by Tier II interventions includes students who have been identified as at risk in a particular content area. This is typically about 15 to 20% of the student population. The population served by intensive interventions includes students with significant and persistent learning or behavioral needs and only makes up about 3 to 5% of the general population. Informal diagnostic assessment refers to data that can be used to identify a student-specific skill deficit and strengths. These data may be derived from standardized measures, error analysis of progress monitoring data, student work samples, behavior rating forms, among other tools. Use of an informal diagnostic assessment should allow teachers to identify a student-specific area of difficulty when lack of progress is evident. This assessment can also inform decisions about how to adapt and individualize interventions for students. Use of informal diagnostic assessment should allow teachers to identify these areas as well, although they are not recommended except for those students with the most significant needs. Handout 7.4 provides a listing of sample diagnostic tools for literacy, behavior, and math. As you learned in the Tier 2 module, fidelity refers to how closely prescribed procedures are followed, and in the context of schools, the degree to which teachers implement programs the way they were intended by the program developers. It also relates to the quality of implementation. Tier 3 starts with the delivery of a Tier 2 intervention with fidelity. However, when students do not respond as expected, a change is needed. With Tier 3, educators use data to make the changes to increase the impact of student performance. To ensure equity among student decisions, teams should apply a standard problem-solving approach when making individual decisions for students receiving Tier 3 supports. In Module 1, you were introduced to the Wyoming problem-solving process. This 4-step process allows schools to use an iterative process to intensify instruction for students receiving Tier 3. The first step is to define the problem and then identify why it is happening. You can do this through informal and formal diagnostic assessments. The team then plans about what should be done. How should we adapt the intervention to make it more effective for the student? Then the adaptation is put in place and we monitor its impact using progress monitoring data. If it worked, we maintain the adaptation. If it didn't work, we redefine the problem and identify why our previous intervention was not effective and what would work best for the student. Let's use the problem-solving process in a student academic example for Jane. In step 1, we identify what is the problem. For Jane, her classroom and screening data indicate that she's at risk for reading difficulties. Although she's a 3rd grader, she is reading at an early 2nd grade level. The next step in the process is to identify why this is happening. The grade level team reviewed running records conducted by the classroom teacher and other classroom data and hypothesized that she lacked appropriate phonological awareness, word study, and fluency skills. The next step in the process is to determine what should be done. The team decides, based on their initial hypothesis about why she's struggling, to place Jane in the following intervention program. It will have 5 students, and she'll have 5 sessions each week for 20 minutes a session. The sessions will end in about 12 weeks, and the content will cover her areas of need. At this step in the problem-solving process, the team also develops a progress monitoring plan to determine if it worked. These data will be necessary for the team to complete step 4 of the problem-solving process. This graph shows Jane's reading progress monitoring data using passage reading fluency with scores of correct words per minute. Her fall benchmark was used as her baseline score. This score was connected with her target score, the star on the far right. The 2nd grade level winner benchmark, which is higher than her score, is indicated by the dot. After 4 weeks, the team reconvenes to review how Jane is responding to the intervention. How do you see her progress? These data are below the goal line, suggesting that Jane is not responding to the validated intervention program at Tier 2. so the team considers what they should do next. Step 4 in the problem-solving process is to determine if it worked. So we look at the responsiveness of Jane to her intervention. Based on Jane's progress, how would you classify her response to the Tier 2 program? What do you think the team should do next? The team determines that Jane is non-responsive, which moves her to the next step in the DBI process. Remember that progress monitoring data helps the team determine when an instructional change is needed. Additional data are necessary to determine the nature of the intervention change needed. With DBI, the problem-solving process is used until an appropriate intervention is found for the student. Remember, DBI is a specific data decision-making approach for intensifying interventions based on data of the student's response to the intervention. When students do not respond to a validated Tier 2 delivered with fidelity, then the DBI process starts. Similar to the problem-solving process at Tier 2, which was just modeled, the DBI process begins with identifying Step 1, what is the problem? Progress monitoring data at this step helps the team describe the problem. Initially, the problem is defined as no or inadequate response to a standardized intervention. The next step is to assess why the problem is happening. For students in the DBI process, it is recommended that educators conduct informal diagnostic, academic, or behavioral assessments. The purpose of these data are to determine why the student is not meeting expectations. The next step in the problem-solving process is to identify what should be done. At this step, the team develops an adaptation, makes an implementation change, or designs a new intervention based on their hypothesis developed through their data analysis. Finally, the team determines, did it work? With DBI, teams use results of ongoing progress monitoring data to assess the impact of the intervention, adaptation, or change. At this point, the team determines if response is positive, negative, or questionable. As you can see in the graphic, positive responses indicate that the adaptation is working and the intervention with the new adaptation should continue. A negative response would indicate that the team should return to Step 2 to identify a new hypothesis based on additional informal diagnostic data. What is different about the problem-solving process used at Tier 2 versus Tier 3 is the frequency. At Tier 3, teachers are moving through the process more frequently and are using the process to make iterative changes to the intervention. For many students in Tier 3, unlike Tier 2, a student may require ongoing problem solving and intervention adaptations. For non-responders, the problem-solving process is ongoing until data suggests that the student is adequately responding to the intervention. For Jane, the team returns back to the previous step to define the new problem. Previously, her classroom and screening data indicate that Jane is at risk for reading difficulties. Although she was in 3rd grade, remember she was reading at an early 2nd grade level. She was placed in a Tier 2 intervention that matched her needs. However, she did not respond as expected. Recent progress monitoring data for performance on 2nd grade passages indicate that Jane is not responding to the validated intervention when it's delivered with fidelity. As a result, she is falling further behind. Progress monitoring assessments help teams determine when an instructional change is needed by allowing teams to assess a student's response. Informal diagnostic assessments allow teams to use available data to help determine the nature of the intervention change that is needed. Teams can review different types of data sources. Teams are encouraged to use the ISIL strategy referred to in Module 3, Database Decision Making, to develop a hypothesis about why students may not be responding to the intervention and its adaptations. Hypotheses should initially focus on variables related to student instruction, curriculum, and environment. The RIOT strategy, also presented in Module 3, can be used to confirm or disconfirm the identified hypotheses. After reviewing the available data, the team develops its hypothesis. If Jane was in a smaller group, then she would probably have more opportunities to respond and got more guided practice and specific feedback. Now that the team has its hypothesis, the next step is to determine how best to adapt or adjust the intervention to address the hypothesis. The team considers two types of changes. Quantitative changes are recommended as the first step in adapting a Tier II intervention. Making this level of adaptation often requires less resources and expertise. In addition, these types of changes work for many students. Common quantitative adaptations includes increasing the intervention frequency, length of session or duration, decreasing the group size, and decreasing the heterogeneity of the intervention group. It's important to note that in many cases, quantitative adaptations may be necessary but not sufficient to facilitate progress for students with intensive needs. In some cases, quantitative changes fail to result in expected growth. Teams may consider making more qualitative changes. Qualitative changes often require more resources and expertise, but they do lead to greater intensity of instruction and individualization. Common examples are to change the instruction based on the learner characteristics, change the delivery method of the content, provide additional adult feedback and error correction, and change part or all of an intervention program. The team of teachers looking at Jane's data use a decision-making tree to assist them in identifying an appropriate quantitative adaptation to the Tier II intervention. The decision tree provides a team a standardized approach for making decisions around intensification of Tier II interventions for non-responders. The team considers where their hypothesis fits within three choices for quantitative adaptations. Remember, the team hypothesized that if Jane was in a smaller group, then she would have more opportunities for guided practice and specific feedback. The team finds in the decision tree, does the student need a smaller group? Using the decision tree, the team reviews the quantitative recommendations for students who need smaller groups. The team determines that one-on-one is the best option since the group is already at 1 to 3. The team conducted the Tier II intervention with fidelity in a one-on-one setting for 4 weeks. For the progress monitoring data plan, data were collected weekly using passage reading fluency. The team reconvenes to move through step 4 of the problem-solving process and assess Jane's response to the addition of a quantitative adaptation. Refer to handout 7.6 in your participant workbook. Individually or with your peers, evaluate the effectiveness of the intensified intervention and record your decision in step 4 of handout 7.3. Was her response positive, negative, or was it questionable? In this case, Jane's data indicates a negative response. Given that our performance is not yet consistent, the team may decide to continue the intervention or may choose to find an additional intervention. The team decides that Jane is not responding to the quantitative adaptation to the Tier II intervention. As a result, the team begins problem solving to determine why the problem continues to exist. Once a new hypothesis is developed, the team determines what should be done. Step 3 of the problem-solving process. Handout 7.4 from earlier prevents this teaming resource. At step 3 of the problem-solving process, the team considers what should be done. The team could try another quantitative adaptation. However, the team determines from their review of data that additional time is not needed, nor does Jane have a problem with attention. Since Jane did not respond to the quantitative adaptation, the team considers more qualitative adaptations that could address the new hypothesis. Diagnostic assessments showed that Jane had difficulty applying decoding strategies to VAL teams. Her teacher applied the following intensive intervention principles to intensify her decoding instruction. She will incorporate more fluency practice of newly taught VAL teams with specified mastery, provide explicit instruction and error correction, and frequently check for retention with reteaching as needed. The team conducted the next set of adaptations with fidelity in a one-on-one setting up through the benchmark testing. Per her progress monitoring plan, data were collected weekly on the passage reading fluency measure. Upon returning from break, the team reconvenes to move through step 4 to determine if it worked. What do you think? Based on the database individualization process for Tier 3, what would you recommend the team's next steps be? As you learned earlier, database individualization in Tier 3 is an ongoing process. The team would likely consider adapting instruction even if she was found eligible for special ed. In this next scenario, we will apply the process to a student with behavioral challenges. In this case, Michael was identified as having externalizing behavior problems in January of his 4th grade year due to an excessive number of office disciplinary referrals, or ODRs, and a frequently instigated fights with other students. The grade level team hypothesized that Michael lacks consistent feedback about appropriate behavior and struggles with motivation. During the Tier 2 problem-solving process, the team determines what should be done. The team identifies a validated intervention program called Check-In, Check-Out. With this intervention, dedicated staff checks in with the student to get ready for the day. Teachers provide feedback on student goals, and then dedicated staff person checks out with the student to reflect on the day. The student can then accumulate points that can be traded in at predetermined times for activities, prizes, or free time. The staff collect daily data and review student progress weekly. The team also determines what should be done to monitor Michael's response to check-in, check-out. 2 measures of Michael's behavior will be collected: the points earned on his check-in, check-out card and his office disciplinary referrals will be collected and reviewed. His teacher uses a brief self-assessment checklist to verify that the intervention is implemented with fidelity. For progress monitoring, the teacher will collect it daily and will review bi-weekly. The goal is based on his specific peer-level expectations. While Michael is receiving check-in, check-out as a standardized Tier II intervention, his progress is being monitored with the school's standard check-in, check-out card. For each period of the day, the appropriate teacher will rate how well, on a scale of 0 to 2, Michael met the 3 school-wide expectations. In step 4, the team determines if it worked. Although some progress was evident, Michael continued to have unacceptable number of ODRs based on school cut points, and he met his daily report card goal of 80% only 40% of the time. Progress monitoring assessments, remember, tell us when an instructional change is needed. Additional data are necessary to determine the nature of the intervention. The team determines that Michael is not responding to the quantitative adaptation to the intervention and returns to the previous step to identify the problem and begin collecting additional data to determine why the problem exists. Once a new hypothesis is developed, the team determines what should be done. Teams are encouraged to use the ISIL strategy referred to in Module 3, Database Decision Making, to develop hypotheses about why a student may not be responding to an intervention or adaptation. Hypotheses should initially focus on variables related to the student's instruction, curriculum, and environment. The RIOT strategy, also presented in Module 3, can be used to confirm or disconfirm the initial hypothesis. The team hypothesizes that if Michael receives social skill instruction surrounding appropriate ways to get attention from others, as well as instruction and monitoring and goals specified to his needs, then Michael will not disrupt the class with verbal and physical outbursts. The next step in the process is to determine what should be done. In the DBI process, this entails identifying how to intensify the intervention based on the new hypothesis. Since the team's hypothesis indicated that Michael had social skill deficits, they decided to add a social skills group to the instruction to his check-in and check-out card. His progress will be monitored with a modified check-in, check-out card that reflects the intervention adaptation. Similar to academics, the first portion of the tool focuses on more quantitative changes, such as adding more monitoring, academic intervention, or social intervention. Making this level of change often requires less resources and expertise. In addition, these types of changes work for many students. Michael's check-in and check-out card is modified. The overall goals stay the same, but he is given specific goals for him to work on. His social goals, Michael will work towards specific goals related to social skills curriculum and school-wide expectations. After 2 weeks, the team reconvenes. The data indicate that Michael met his check-in, check-out goal on 5 of 10 days. He received 2 ODRs during that time. Michael is making some progress and is now meeting his check-in, check-out goal 50% of the time. Do you think the intensification strategy is working? What should the team do next? The team decides that Michael is not responding to the quantitative adaptation to the intervention. As a result, the team begins problem solving and returns to the collection of functional assessment data in the database individualization process. After 1 or 2 more attempts to modify Michael's Tier II intervention, the team considers more intensive quantitative changes. This includes modifying the progress monitoring approach, as well as continued progress monitoring using a new tool. Because Michael did not respond to several attempts to intensify the check-in, check-out card, and program, the team conducts a functional behavior assessment and develops a behavior intervention plan. In doing this, the team will have sufficient data to identify a more intensive, individualized intervention. In some cases, an additional or alternative progress monitoring tool would be used. After clearly defining Michael's problem behavior and gathering more information, the team began to analyze the function of Michael's behavior. The team hypothesizes that the function of some of his behaviors is to gain attention from peers, while the function of other behaviors, such as running from class or hiding, are to avoid a task. Teams should follow their state and district procedures for conducting an FBA and developing a behavior intervention plan. The team identifies what component to add to the behavior intervention plan. The team continues check-ins with the modified goals. It provides increased opportunities for practice and prompting and reinforcement for appropriate behavior. The team also adds explicitly teaching positive replacement behaviors, including initiating contact with peers and appropriately making requests. The team returns to the last step in the problem-solving process to determine, did it work? This graph shows that although Michael struggled in the beginning of the implementation of his new behavior intervention plan, the data indicate that Michael's performance became more consistent and he was able to meet his check-in, check-out goal on 6 of 10 days. In addition, he only had 1 ODR during that time compared to 2 in the previous review period. Although Michael is making some progress and is now meeting his goal 60% of the time, the team will continue to make adaptations until Michael consistently reaches his goal of 80% total check-in, check-out points. Similar to what you learned in Module 6, Evidence-Based Tier 2, it's important to regularly review the efficacy of your Tier 3 system. Here are some things to consider. Is the database individualization process being implemented with fidelity? Are the adaptations made using valid progress monitoring data? Are most students identified for Tier 3 supports responding to the Tier 3 system? And what percentage move to less intensive supports? Finally, does the Tier 3 system align with special education pre-referral documentation and requirements? Although there is no empirical evidence about the percentage of students who should respond to intensive interventions, it is generally accepted that the majority of students should respond, whether they are in special education or in general education. For general education students who fail to respond to ongoing intensive interventions through Tier 3, teams may consider a referral to special ed. For students in special education who require ongoing intensive interventions, the individual education program team may want to consider additional accommodations and modifications as well as potential revisions to the IEP. Future modules will discuss how teams of educators can conduct deep dives into their data to determine the efficacy of Tier 3. In this module, you learned about the essential criteria for a Tier 3 system and the use of database individualization to meet the requirements of a Tier 3 system. There are some things to remember. DBI is intense, and relatively few students should need it, only about 3 to 5% of your population. It's important to remember, too, that academic and behavioral supports do not exist in isolation. Often, especially for students at Tier 3, they are occurring concurrently. Don't make too many intervention adaptations at a single opportunity. This often makes it difficult to assess what is working for the student and what is not working for the student. Do you remember the 5 components of DBI for Tier 3? Remember, we begin with the Tier 2 intervention delivered with greater intensity. and monitor progress to determine the student's response. If a student is responsive, then we continue. But if a student does not sufficiently respond, we'll gather additional information through diagnostic assessments, which identify students' needs to guide intervention adaptations. We will continue to progress monitor to make decisions about whether or not the student is responding to intensive interventions. The leading resource for DBI and Tier III interventions is the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Their website offers many tools for schools and districts to use to design and implement a system of intensive interventions. These tools include tools charts for identifying appropriate tools for monitoring progress as well as in intervening, data meeting tools for preparing and implementing data teams for Tier 3, sample lesson plans and for adapting or intensifying Tier 2, and then fidelity and document tools for monitoring implementation. The WDE provides districts numerous resources to support MTSS implementation through the Wyoming Project WIN website. Several of the resources discussed in this module are featured on its main page. Throughout the Wyoming MTSS Introductory module series, your team used or you used the MTSS Fidelity rubric to reflect on what the essential components of MTSS are: screening, progress monitoring, tiered instruction, and database decision-making. Now that you're familiar with what MTSS is, the next step is to assess and plan for MTSS implementation. The Wyoming Department of Education has developed MTSS implementation checklists for both academics and behavior. These tools allow teams to assess the extent to which they are implementing MTSS and identify potential next steps for implementation. This is often referred to how to implement MTSS. Module 7 is the final module in the MTSS Essential Component Introductory series. The previous 6 modules introduce you to the other essential components of MTSS. If you have not completed these, it's highly recommended that you and your team complete these modules. To test your understanding of the content, consider completing Module 7 quiz. You can access the answers from the State MTSS Coach. The purpose of this module series was to provide educators with an overview of the essential components of MTSS in Wyoming. The content included in these modules should in no way be viewed as exhaustive or legally binding. You should continue to seek and participate in ongoing professional development and coaching related to supporting implementation of the knowledge you gained through this series. For more information or for on-site training, contact Bart Lyman, the Wyoming State MTSS Coach. You can also contact Jennifer Heiler, the Wyoming State Personnel Development Grant Program Manager.